The Atlantic crashed against the cliffs below, but inside the mansion, the air was perfectly still. Arthur stood at the head of the mahogany table, his shadow stretching long across the polished floor. 3 figures stood opposite him: Marcus, Elena, and Leo. The hall was vast, designed to make anyone feel small, yet the silence between them carried more weight than the architecture. Arthur did not speak immediately. He looked at each of them, his gaze lingering just long enough to make the silence uncomfortable. Then, he moved. He pulled 3 identical envelopes from his side and laid them down on the wood with a sharp, rhythmic thud. 1 for Marcus, 1 for Elena, 1 for Leo. The envelopes were heavy, sealed with wax, and sat in the center of the table. The children watched the envelopes, then each other. The competition had not been spoken aloud, but it was already vibrating. Arthur cleared his throat, the sound sharp as a whip crack in the vaulted space. $5,000 each, he stated, his voice steady and devoid of warmth. He tapped the envelopes, one by one. 30 days. That is all you have. Whoever builds the most value from this starting point inherits the empire. He paused, letting the numbers sink into the floorboards. The air in the hall seemed to thin. Marcus shifted his weight, his eyes locked on the envelope nearest his hand. Elena glanced at the grandfather clock ticking in the corner, her jaw set tight. Leo remained perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the mahogany grain. 30 days to prove your worth, Arthur continued, his eyes scanning the trio. The market does not care for excuses, and neither do I. Go. The challenge was absolute. No guidance, no safety net. The empire was not a gift to be handed down, but a prize to be seized through sheer force of will. The siblings stood frozen for a heartbeat, the weight of the legacy pressing down on them. The clock had started. Every second spent standing in this room was a second lost to the competition. The hall, once a place of family gathering, had transformed into a battlefield. Marcus was the first to break. He lunged forward, fingers closing around the envelope with a sharp intake of breath. He did not look back at his father or his siblings. He turned on his heel and strode toward the heavy oak doors, his pace rapid and purposeful. Elena followed seconds later. She snatched her envelope, her eyes already darting toward the exit, her thumb tracing the glass of her watch. She moved with a frantic energy, her footsteps echoing against the marble floor as she disappeared into the hallway. The room suddenly felt cavernous and empty. The sound of the doors closing behind them left a hollow ring in the air. Leo did not move. He stood exactly where he had been, his focus shifting from the table to the slim laptop he had carried into the hall. He opened the lid, the screen casting a pale, steady light across his face. He did not reach for the envelope. He did not check the time. He simply pulled a chair back, sat down, and began to type. Leo remained in the center of the silence, his fingers moving with a rhythmic precision. Marcus found a warehouse on the edge of the industrial district by noon. It was a hollow, concrete shell, smelling of dust and stagnant air. He dropped his envelope on a workbench, the paper sliding across the grit. He did not waste time. He drove to the lumber yard, his truck bed rattling under the weight of raw timber. He spent $4,000 in one transaction, trading his liquid capital for stacks of oak and heavy-duty saws. The wood was rough, smelling of sap and earth. He hauled the boards into the warehouse, his muscles straining against the load. Every plank he stacked represented a chunk of his inheritance. He bought a lathe, a sander, and a set of chisels, clearing out the last of his funds. By the time he finished, the warehouse was filled with the scent of sawdust. He stood in the center of the floor, surrounded by the raw potential of his investment. He picked up a chisel, tested the edge against his thumb, and began to measure the first board. He was betting everything on his own hands. The work was slow, deliberate, and physically demanding. Elena bypassed the physical world entirely. She set up a workstation in a high-rise office, the glass walls reflecting the city skyline. She opened her trading app, the interface glowing with rows of shifting numbers. She bet the full $5,000 on volatile tech stocks, watching the ticker crawl upward. For a moment, the screen flashed green. A $2,000 gain appeared, a spike of adrenaline that made her fingers hover over the sell button. She hesitated, waiting for more. The market turned. The green numbers bled into red. She watched $3,000 vanish in a single afternoon. Her pulse quickened. She refreshed the app, the screen stuttering as it updated. Her dwindling balance. $4,000 remained. She tapped the screen again, trying to chase the loss, her movements becoming jagged and erratic. The numbers flickered, mocking her attempts to regain control. Every refresh brought a new, lower total. She leaned closer to the screen, her eyes tracking the downward trajectory of the charts. The room was silent, except for the faint, rhythmic ping of notifications, signaling further drops. Leo walked into a quiet cafe, the hum of an espresso machine the only sound in the room. He sat at a corner table, his laptop open. He did not look at wood or stock charts. He spent $500 on a domain name and a set of automation tools. His fingers moved across the keys, building a bridge between local artisans and global buyers. He was not making products. He was building a path for them to move. He spent the next week writing code, refining the logic of the system. He did not touch a hammer, nor did he watch the ticker of a volatile market. He focused on the architecture of the connection. Every line of code was a brick in a digital wall that would eventually work without his presence. He sat for hours, the cafe crowd shifting around him, his attention locked on the screen. He was creating a machine that would handle the transactions, the logistics, and the sales. By the end of the week, the system was live. He closed the laptop, the initial setup complete. He had spent a fraction of his capital, yet he had built a network that required no further manual input to function. The quiet of the cafe matched the precision of his work. Marcus stood in the center of a drafty warehouse, the smell of sawdust thick in the air. He had spent $4,000 on heavy-duty saws and raw timber, leaving only a sliver of his capital. By the fifth day, the novelty of the project had vanished, replaced by a dull ache in his lower back. He wiped sweat from his forehead, leaving a smudge of grease across his skin. His palms were mapped with deep, angry calluses, the skin torn and raw. From hours of gripping, vibrating tools, he looked at the single table sitting in the corner, the only piece he had managed to finish and sell. He did the math in his head, dividing his total effort by the $5,200 currently in his ledger. The profit was negligible, barely covering the cost of the wood. He picked up a heavy plank, his muscles trembling from the strain of the morning. He dropped it onto the workbench, with a hollow thud that echoed through the empty space. He was working harder than he ever had in his life, yet the warehouse remained cavernous and quiet. He stared at the stacks of unfinished lumber, the reality of his exhaustion settling in. He leaned against the workbench, watching the sun dip below the warehouse windows. Elena sat in her office, the glow of 3 monitors illuminating her face. She bypassed the slow growth of traditional assets, diving headfirst into volatile tech stocks. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, clicking through charts that pulsed with frantic energy. A sudden green flash on the screen signaled a $2,000 gain. She leaned back, a sharp smile crossing her face as she watched the numbers climb. But the momentum stalled. Within minutes, the indicators turned blood red. The market swung violently, the value of her positions collapsing in a single brutal afternoon. She refreshed the application, her eyes darting across the flickering data. The $2,000 profit vanished, followed immediately by $3,000 of her initial capital. Her hands began to tremble, the vibration traveling from her fingertips into the desk. She clicked frantically, trying to sell, trying to hedge, trying to stop the bleed. The numbers continued to slide downward. Her total balance hit $4,000 and kept dropping. She gripped the edge of the desk until her knuckles turned white, her breathing shallow and uneven. The screen displayed a sea of red, the rapid loss stripping away her confidence. She stared at the final lower figure, the reality of her gamble settling into the silence of the room. While his siblings chased immediate results through sweat and speculation, Leo sat in the corner of a quiet cafe. The ambient noise of the city faded into a steady hum. Ignored. He opened his laptop, the screen a stark contrast to the dim lighting. He spent $500 on a domain and software, the only investment he would make. For the next 7 days, he did not touch a hammer, nor did he watch a ticker. He mapped out the logic of a digital marketplace, writing lines of code that would serve as the foundation for his venture. His fingers moved across the keyboard in a rhythmic, deliberate cadence. He built an automated affiliate system designed to bridge the gap between local artisans and global buyers. Every function he programmed was a brick in a wall he never had to physically lift. He spent hours refining the algorithm, ensuring that the connection would require no manual intervention. He ignored the urge to rush, focusing instead on the architecture of his machine. By the end of the week, the code was compiled, and the platform was live. He closed the laptop, the silence now filled with the potential of a system that would operate regardless of his physical presence. He had built a bridge. Day 15 arrived with a crushing weight for Marcus. The warehouse, once a place of potential, had become a cage of his own making. 10 orders sat on his desk, demand he had successfully generated but could no longer satisfy. He paced the concrete floor, his boots echoing against the walls. He had no time left to craft the custom pieces, and his remaining capital had evaporated. He pulled out his phone, dialing a contact to hire a pair of extra hands, but the conversation ended in seconds. Without cash to pay for labor, he was alone. He looked at the half-finished woods scattered across the workspace, the sawdust coating his skin and hair. Every piece required hours of precise physical effort. He realized then that his output was tethered entirely to his own body, and his body was failing. He dropped to the floor, leaning his back against a stack of unworked lumber. The silence of the warehouse felt heavy, pressing in on him. He had built a business that required him to be everywhere at once, but he was only one man. He stared at the empty workbench, the realization of his defeat setting in. Miles away, Elena sat in a room, illuminated only by the harsh blue light of 3 monitors. Her eyes were bloodshot, fixed on the jagged lines of the stock charts. She had spent the last 5 days chasing losses, her movements becoming erratic and desperate. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, tapping a frantic rhythm. She clicked a sell order, then immediately canceled it, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The screen flashed red, then green, then red again. She moved money in and out of accounts with a feverish intensity, trying to force the market to yield. A sudden dip in the tech sector sent her balance plummeting. She lunged for the mouse, her hand trembling so violently she missed the cursor twice. She executed a high-risk buy, hoping for a rebound that never came. The money counter above her screen flickered, dancing between $3,500 and $4,000. It was a digital heartbeat, erratic and failing. She leaned back, her chair scraping harshly against the floor, and stared at the numbers as they bled away. Every refresh of the application brought a new drop, a new failure. She was no longer trading. She was drowning in the volatility. In a corner of a quiet cafe, the air smelled of roasted beans and rain. Leo sat alone, his laptop screen glowing with lines of clean, structured code. He did not look at the clock or the mounting pressure of the deadline. He reached out and clicked a single button, finalizing the deployment of his affiliate network. For a moment, the screen remained still. Then, the first notification pinged a sharp, clear sound that cut through the ambient noise of the room. A second ping followed, then a third. The rhythm began to accelerate, a steady, mechanical drumbeat that signaled the system was live. Each sound represented a connection made between a local artisan and a buyer on the other side of the world. Leo did not reach for a hammer or watch the volatile flicker of a stock ticker. He simply watched the dashboard. The notifications arrived with increasing frequency, a cascade of data that required no physical labor to sustain. He adjusted a single line of code to optimize the flow, his movements deliberate and calm. The quiet hum of the cafe remained, but the digital world around him had begun to shift, gaining a momentum that neither of his siblings could match. The dashboard became a blur of activity. Every ping was a transaction, a digital handshake occurring in real time across continents. Leo watched the counter tick upward, the numbers rolling with a speed that made his pulse quicken. $6,000. The screen refreshed, and the figure jumped to 7,000. He leaned into the glow of the monitor, his fingers dancing across the keys. To shunt traffic, as the server load spiked under the sudden influx of buyers, the system was breathing, expanding to meet the demand. 8,000. 10,000. The notifications were no longer individual pings. They merged into a continuous high-pitched chime that filled the small space. He adjusted the algorithm, trimming the latency to ensure every commission was captured. The counter hit 11,000, then surged past 12. He sat back, the blue light reflecting in his eyes. There was no physical exhaustion, no sweat, no frantic movement, just the cold, hard efficiency of a machine. The numbers climbed higher, a relentless upward trajectory that turned his initial investment into a growing fortune. The system was scaling. Across the city, the warehouse was a tomb of unfinished ambition. Marcus stood in the center of the floor, surrounded by stacks of raw timber and half-assembled furniture. His hands were raw, the skin cracked. 10 orders sat on his desk, each one a promise he could no longer keep. He reached for his ledger, but the numbers stared back at him with brutal clarity. His capital was gone. Every dollar had been poured into equipment. He picked up a chisel, held it for a moment, and then set it down on the workbench with a final hollow clack. He walked to the main breaker and pulled the lever. The hum of the saws died instantly, leaving a heavy silence. He looked at the rows of wood that would never become tables. There was no way to scale his hands. He grabbed his keys, turned his back on the warehouse, and walked out the door, leaving the dream behind. Elena sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the flickering display. The lines on the screen were jagged, erratic, and unforgiving. She had bet everything on a single tech sector surge, but the market had turned. A red notification flashed. Margin call imminent. She tapped the screen, trying to shift funds, but the interface locked. Her balance, once a promising figure, began to bleed away in real time. $2,000. The number blinked, a final warning of her shrinking control. She tried to execute a hedge, a desperate move to stabilize the position, but the sell-off was too fast. The system processed the trade at a loss, and the counter dropped again. 2,000. The screen went static for a heartbeat. She pushed back from the desk, the chair scraping sharply against the floor. The frantic energy that had fueled her for weeks vanished, replaced by a cold, hollow stillness. She stood up, leaving the laptop open, the glowing charts now irrelevant. She walked toward the glass doors of the office, stepping out onto the balcony. The sun was dipping low over the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the terrace. She watched the light fade, the warmth of the day retreating. The heavy iron gates of the mansion groaned as they swung shut, sealing the estate from the outside world. Marcus, Elena, and Leo walked up the stone path, their footsteps echoing against the facade of the cliffside home. The Atlantic crashed against the rocks below, a rhythmic, relentless sound that filled the gaps in their silence. They entered the grand hall, the mahogany table standing in the center like an altar. Arthur sat in his high-backed chair. Marcus entered first, his shoulders slumped, his hands empty. Elena followed, her pace measured, her expression unreadable. Leo walked in last, his laptop bag slung over his shoulder, his movements calm and deliberate. They stopped at the edge of the table. Arthur did not move, his hands resting flat on the polished wood. The air in the hall felt thin. No one spoke. The only sound was the distant roar of the ocean and the steady, ticking clock. Marcus stepped forward first. He placed his ledger on the table, the pages worn and stained from weeks of labor. He spoke of the orders he could not fulfill and the capital he had exhausted. Arthur barely glanced at the figures before nodding. Elena moved next, showing a history of trades that ended in a sharp decline. Her voice was steady, but her hands gripped the table. She had nothing left to offer but the memory of her losses. Then, Leo stepped into the center of the light. He set his laptop on the mahogany surface and flipped the lid. The screen glowed, casting a cool blue hue across the hall. He tapped a key, and a dashboard expanded, showing a map of the world pulsing with active, automated transactions. $50,000. The total sat there, a stark, undeniable reality. Marcus leaned in, his eyes wide. Elena looked from the screen to Leo, her breath hitching. The hall felt smaller, the air tighter, as the reality of his success settled. Arthur reached out and snapped the laptop shut. The sudden click sounded like a gavel in the vast hall. He turned his gaze toward Marcus. "You have the work ethic of a builder, but you ignored leverage," he said, his voice steady. He shifted his focus to Elena. "You have the courage of a gambler, but you ignored the necessity of systems." He looked at Leo, then stood up, the chair scraping sharply against the stone floor. Arthur walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to the room, looking out at the endless movement of the Atlantic. He pointed toward the horizon where the water met the sky. "Wealth is not about how hard you work," he said, his voice carrying. "It is about how well you build the system that works for you." He stood still, watching the tide pull back from the shore. The room remained silent. He did not turn around, leaving the weight of the truth to settle on the mahogany table behind him. Arthur turned away from the window. He walked back to the table and stopped in front of Leo. The silence in the hall held steady. "The empire is yours to manage," Arthur said. He placed a hand on Leo's shoulder, a firm, heavy pressure. "Not because you are the smartest, but because you understood the power of scale." Marcus and Elena stood motionless. Without another word, Arthur walked toward the heavy oak doors. The hinges groaned as he pushed them open. Marcus and Elena followed him out, their footsteps echoing against the stone until they faded into the distance. Leo remained at the table. He opened the laptop again. The dashboard glowed, the numbers continuing their steady, rhythmic climb.